Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to each and every one of you. Welcome. My name is Maurizio Benazzo.
My name is Zaya Benazzo.
And we are here in the unceded territory of coastal Milwaukee and South Pomo, known colonially as Sebastopol, California.
And welcome back, everyone. If you were with us the previous 2 days, if you're new, welcome. And we'll be holding these conversations now for 21 days to accompany the film release and also to expand on some of the themes in the movie. Yesterday, we were with historians that were giving us a little bit the long historical perspective on the situation in Palestine, Israel. And today we will touch on trauma, intergenerational trauma, because we're also human beings and we live in bodies, and our ancestors had wounds and we carry those wounds in our nervous system, in our bodies, and they're part of the fabric of any conflict. And so this is what we will be contemplating today, learning how trauma works, how intergenerational trauma is passed. And we'll have time again for a conversation at the end. Mm-hmm. So today with us, we're very privileged to have two incredible women, professors, and also practitioners, trauma healing practitioners that can share from the depths of their hearts, because they've worked also on their own trauma through their own experience, and now they're sharing their wisdom and their knowledge with us. And
should I read the bios?
Short bios.
Should I read a short bios? So you get a feeling who we have here. So first of all, let's start with Gail. We have Gail Brenner. Gail Brenner, PhD, is a psychologist, author, teacher with a special expertise working with older adults and their families in the transition of aging, death, and dying. She was an assistant clinical professor at the University of California, San Francisco, and is the author of the award-winning The End of Self-Help and Suffering is Optional. She loves exploring different cultures through international volunteering. And one other detail, Sand is now currently the new president of Science and Mutuality. She's the new president of the board of Sand. So it's a joy and an honor to have you as our boss. Thank
Welcome,
you, Gail,
Gail.
for being here. Thank you so much for being here. And then Mace Imad. She is a neuroscientist and educator, student, and seeker combining scientific methodology with relational and phenomenological epistemology to understand life's intricacies. Her work focuses on educational innovation that helps students reach their potential while enriching our community. She advocates for practices that advance democratic ideal of opportunity, empowerment, and truth and justice. Through this interdisciplinary approach, Mace strives to deepen our understanding of the brain and foster societal progress. It is a joy and an honor to have you. We met in person once, and it was really such a pleasure to meet you. So welcome. Welcome. Yes.
Thank you for your support also with the translation.
Yes.
Arabic translation of the film, and just in general, you've been a presence for us since the release of the Wisdom of Trauma film.
Immediately. Thank you.
So, welcome. I think you muted. I'll ask you to unmute. I think automatically does that. Hold on. Let's try again. Okay. There you go.
Right. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Wonderful. Well, I am going to begin with, I feel drawn to begin with Alhamdulillah. For Muslims, it's a common prayer, a supplication of gratitude to the one divine source that we believe we all of humanity come from. And I want to thank all of you who are watching, who are present with us, who will be watching this later today. I have an exercise that I do with my students, and it's an exercise about the heart, where I tell students that learning is social, is emotional, and it's very much embodied. We don't just learn with our nervous system, we learn with our whole body and our heart. And the science on the heart and the heart-brain connection is really fascinating. And so I want to, in Arabic, when the word for heart is qalb, and the root for that comes from the verb to turn, that we're in a constant state of turning, searching, turning towards each other's humanity, towards the truth in search. So I want to invite you to listen, to tune in with your heart. And when something I say or is said during today's session doesn't sit well with you, I want to invite you to go into your heart and really use it as an opportunity to learn, what is going on. So in preparing for this session today, I struggled with how to start and what to include. There's a part of me that wanted to delve right into the science of trauma and my research, and really to hide behind or establish my credibility as and behind my credibility using my academic hat. And I prepared fancy PowerPoint slides with lots of academic citations, but there was something that just did not sit well with me, with my heart. And in fact, I felt that going about it that way, the academic, the intellectual, it would not honor the gravity of this moment. And so I pivoted. So instead of a typical academic presentations that I'm usually used to giving, what I decided to do and what I am going to do, I'm going to tell stories interwoven with insight about trauma, about re-traumatization, about bearing witness, about taking actions, and about this notion of moving from vicious cycles of trauma to virtuous cycles of healing and wisdom. What I hope to do. So I'm going to begin with sharing my own story and why this work of trauma-informed care is very personal to me. And beyond my academic credentials, I am a refugee. I was born and raised in Baghdad, Iraq, until the age of 14. I lived there during the first Gulf War. That was in 1991. I experienced the war, the bombing, the destruction, not just of buildings, but of people, of humanity. I experienced the debilitating effect of the sanction. In fact, at 14, I would ask questions that would last with me until this very moment, questions that are about trauma and betrayal, questions that I am very certain many Palestinians in Gaza, in the West Bank, in Palestine, and abroad in the diaspora are asking. So my family and I survived the war in 1991. We survived the war, but every cell in my body remembers that war and carries. It's kind of like our body becomes an archive. And I'm going to talk about that archive is not just carrying my story, but carrying ancestral stories. And I want to bring, part of sharing that story, I want to talk about one particular night during the bombing. It was a heavy night. And it was the night that, in fact, they recommended that we all go to shelters. And my grandfather did not want us to go to shelters. He wanted, if we were going to die, that we would die together. And it was that night that Al Amriya shelter was bombed, where women and children were staying, and we were home. And I remembered bombs were falling as if it was falling right next to me. And as a 14-year-old middle school child, I feared not so much for dying, but that my parents were going to die and I would stay alive. And I remember whispering to myself and asking, a question that for a long time perplexed me. I asked, why would you do this to us? Why are you doing this to us? And by you, I was speaking to the American people. And for a long time, I was even embarrassed to utter why I asked this question because I didn't know any American. But my young, innocent, middle school self understood this notion of common bond that we have with human beings, all human beings, and the sense of betrayal that I felt, right? And I have been thinking about that night and that question and the sense of betrayal and the rupture that continues to wound and traumatize and re-traumatize since October 7, and how many Palestinian children are silently whispering, why are we doing this to them? In fancy terms, and those, when we study trauma, researchers, we call this shattered assumption theory. We could study trauma from the brain perspective, from psychological, from behavioral. And this shattered assumption is when trauma makes us question our basic assumptions about ourselves, about the world, about the future, about the bonds that we are born to kind of, born into. It causes that deep rupture that stays with us. When I said we survived the war, but every cell in my body. So I keep thinking about that rupture. I keep thinking about the trauma of betrayal. And I keep thinking about how Palestinians, their trauma hasn't really stopped, right? In the movie, it was referenced how the trauma keeps going. So there isn't any post-trauma, right? And the rupture continues, the deafening silence. So if you would indulge me, I wanna just go a little bit deeper into this shattered assumptions. Anthropologist Rebecca Lester mentions how trauma pushes us to the edge of existence, right? We questions our humanity, even our humanity. The South African professor Pumla Gobodo-Madikizela says, what does it mean to be human in the aftermath of violence and trauma? And I would say, what does it mean to be human now in the midst of that violence of trauma, witnessing it, whether we're experiencing it directly or vicariously through social media, live streamed? So trauma is very much relational, and I would say it's also very much spiritual and, of course, physiological, which is what I have been researching with my students and the effect of that. So I want to, now fast forward. I leave Iraq. I become a refugee in the same country that displaced me and destroyed my homeland. And so fast forward to 2003, I was a graduate student in Detroit, Michigan, studying now cellular and clinical neurobiology, trying to understand the brain, trying to understand how we live the world through the lens of the nervous system. And during 2003 is when the invasion of Iraq happened and the occupation. So now I am in the diaspora, and again, I keep thinking about and feeling the Palestinians who are in the diaspora and experiencing the destruction, the genocide, the massacres from, and then witnessing the apathy, the silence, the relativization, marginalization of the trauma of their people and their ancestors, and what that does. And I remember as a graduate student that re-trauma, and I remember it felt like a slow death, just like life being sucked. And it has felt like a slow death since October 7. And I would argue, in terms of the Palestinian plight, actually before October 7. If you had any knowledge about what was going on before October 7 in the West Bank, in Gaza, it felt like that, life being sucked from you. So it was then when I began to have the language to describe what happens to us physiologically. And that we say that trauma is very much a sensory problem and a memory problem. And what I mean by that is that it overwhelms our senses. And the memory intrudes unexpectedly, and it can be violent. And in a way, I would say that's when I began to understand that in the body, the physiology is not just carrying my trauma, but it's also carrying others. Because those memory, those sensory overwhelm was really coming from witnessing from afar other people. And I began to understand that I was carrying, and that we carry, an ancestral story of trauma and injustice. So reflecting on this and how, during that time, the occupation, the invasion, the Abu Ghraib, the so on, and this is not about the Iraq story, but I'm just bringing my story to share why this story is so personal, this work on trauma. I began to dissociate, a typical coping mechanism so we could continue to. But in dissociating, I began to also, fast forward a decade and a half later, I began to see that the danger of what happens when it's not so much we don't acknowledge the trauma, but when we don't metabolize the trauma. It doesn't go away, it stays with us. And then perhaps it transforms into other things, and this is when this notion of cycles began, vicious cycles, trauma begets trauma. So this is where I want to, talk about this notion of intergenerational. I have been doing work with indigenous healers and practitioners in West Africa and in East Africa, looking at intergenerational trauma, intergenerational healing, intergenerational wisdom. And again, this notion of my body isn't just scoring my experiences, but also archiving past traumas. And it is through my work with those healers that I began to really focus on and understand the criticality of the question of what are we supposed to do with this intergenerational trauma, right? And what I mean by that is I began to ask, how can I use my experience and my experiences of trauma and my understanding of it to try to understand the bigger picture? And in this case, to try to understand what can we do to break the cycles of trauma. And And I would say for me, what I'm sitting with is this notion of bearing witness as a critical first step. And we are here today to bear witness to the Palestinian stories, their indigeneity, their trauma, and also their resilience, their hope and their joy, and the hope that we all carry and the power that we all carry to transmute, to not live in the shadow of trauma, but to transmute vicious cycle into more virtuous one. So those are my opening remarks, and I'm gonna pass it on now to Gail, and I look forward to hearing your thoughts and your questions.
Great. I just want to take a moment to let what you offered here, Maze, land in us. So that was so rich and heartfelt and personal. So can we just take a moment, just turn your attention inward towards yourself? Just to take a moment and see, like, what is arising in you? Maybe regarding what was shared, maybe something that's in you regarding your reaction to seeing the film and this topic. As we begin to metabolize and digest what we're experiencing, this becomes our own work of our own inner trauma. So maybe you can take a moment just to reflect inside what's arising in you, what's gotten activated in you. What do you feel in your body in this moment? And if you want to close your eyes, you're welcome to do that, or maybe just soften your gaze and just have this be a holy moment for your own self-care and self-compassion. So just notice the breath. So here we are, breathing here in our space together. So we invite in our shared breath. And I invite you, if anything that I'm offering here is triggering for you in a way that it becomes overwhelming, distract, look around your room, take care of yourself. What we're talking about here can be very activating. We start with our own experience, maybe defined by our own trauma, and then the traumas in the world today when we include the human family. And then our own thread of intergenerational trauma that we all carry to some extent or another. So just noticing how the breath is moving in you right now. And if it helps, you might want to put a hand on your heart, because these are heart practices and heart moments here, which I think is probably why you're here today, because you care. So at any time, you can lean into our field here that we create together, because we're here with a shared intention of truth-telling, of bearing witness, of feeling. And it starts with ourselves. So this is a moment here for you to give your loving attention toward yourself. So Maze mentioned how important it is to include the body, because that's where trauma lives. And we're meant as humans to be feeling beings. So we react to the world, we react to what we hear and see and learn. And that reaction always has a root in the body. So taking a moment to bring your attention into your body, which is a big investigation. So take your time with it. Just notice any sensations that might be appearing. Anywhere in your body, in your head, in your face, shoulders or back. Your belly, your feet, and anywhere. And maybe noticing how that is for you to pay attention to your body and be curious about what's happening here. There's an openness to curiosity, to turning toward ourselves and exploring our experience. So can you bring a sense of openness to whatever you notice? And maybe be aware of what's happening energetically for you. Is there an anxious feeling in your body, jittery, frozen, shut down, foggy, light and joyful maybe? So with everything you notice, it's a bowing of yes, I see you, you can be here. Because in this work, we touch places where it's hard, it's tender. And there's the invitation always to be very tender with ourselves. And maybe you'll notice some young parts of you that might be activated. And as best as you can in this moment, just honoring those parts, holding them, loving them. And maybe for you, it feels disconnected and even chaotic when you turn in toward yourself. And that's okay too. Whatever you notice is welcomed. And with that, we hold each other when we can't hold our own feeling alone.